and welcome. I'm really glad to have you here today. We want to talk about designing for deeper learning, something we care about, and I was really pleased to join Upside with a focus on this. To give you an idea of our direction, I want to talk about why we should care about deeper learning and what it is, talk about practice and reflection engagement as three major components of deeper learning, and talk a little bit about going forward. I want to give you a little bit of my background just to help you understand the strange and twisted way I look at the world and interpret my comments with that basis. So after a job designing and programming educational computer games, I realized we didn't know enough, and I went back to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. And I took the academic route after that, teaching at the University of New South Wales, teaching interface design, but my passion was still ed tech, and that was my research area. I joined some startups in the learning and technology space, a couple of government-sponsored ones, and then one back here in the US, before becoming an independent consultant. And for the past couple decades, I've been working with corporates and not-for-profits and government and education institutions and more, advising them on how we take what we know about the learning sciences to the design of performance solutions for organizations. Along the way, I've written 7 books covering things like technology, games, mobile, and articles on adaptive and on learning design, on the learning science, on myths and engagement and strategy as well. So, and have spoken on those topics a variety of places around the world. So that's just, but that focus on the cognitive science, the underpinnings of how we think, work, and learn applied to meeting organizational needs is a recurrent theme throughout I talk about, and hopefully presents a perspective you can understand for what we're talking about today. I want to start out by talking about what is learning. And I'm talking about not our formal instruction, but how we learn as humans naturally. And I want to suggest as a simplified perspective, learning is action and reflection. When you're doing things not from a schooling perspective, but things you want to do, your hobbies, sports, what have you, you do things and you reflect on it. And that individually is how we learn. If we act, there can be some, subconscious learning where we don't have to constantly reflect, but if we really want to accelerate it, reflecting helps cement our understanding and extend it to new situations, which is all well and good, but there are some things we are wired to learn, what they call biologically primary learning, and this is things like language and social interactions. But other things we're not so wired to learn. These are called biologically secondary learning. And these are things we have created, and yet they're important for organizational learning. These are things like mathematics and economics and a bunch of societal creations that are important to us, and yet we aren't naturally wired to learn them. And for that, we use instruction. And for instruction, what that model suggests is instruction should be designed action and guided reflection, which is not particularly representative of what we see. We tend to see instead information presentation and knowledge tests, not designed action and guided reflection. I want that perspective to underpin the rest of our conversation today. Brief comment. Why do we learn? What are our goals for learning? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the important outcomes? Well, traditionally, we talk about 2 goals for learning. One is retention over time from the learning situation till it's needed to be applied. And the second thing is transfer to all appropriate situations and no inappropriate ones. So really, we have these goals because the distance between the learning situation when it actually gets applied, if it's not there anymore, it doesn't help us. And if we can't transfer to all the situations that need, we haven't really met our goal. I want to add a third thing here, impact. We don't learn for knowledge's sake. We learn to be able to do things that we can't do now. And from an organizational perspective, we learn to do things that the organization needs us to do better or has decided that we're now going to do. So we really are learning for reasons to achieve something that we retain over time and transfer, but things that matter to the organization. And it's not, I will suggest that what's going to make the difference to your organization is not the ability to better recite facts, but it's going to be the ability to make better decisions. And that's going to also underpin the conversation. So, title of this is Designing for Deeper Learning, not just learning, deeper learning. And what is deeper learning then? Well, specifically, we take what we were talking about already and unpack that. To me, deeper learning is grounded in the cognitive and learning sciences. Cognitive science was established as an integrative field, recognizing that philosophers and neuroscientists and linguists and psychologists were all talking about how we think. And they realized they needed an integrated area where everybody could talk instead of each doing their own research and not being aware of anybody else. Well, that happened around 1980. In 1990, roughly, they recognized that similarly, instructional designers and learning theorists and cognitive scientists were studying the learnings. And so they created the field of learning sciences to create another interdisciplinary area for people to talk specifically about learning. The research there underpins what deeper learning really should be, applying what we know about cognition and learning to the design of solutions. Now, why do I include cognitive in there? Well, the fundamental thinking loop, the information processing loop that we go through is really cognitive psychology. It's the how we process information, how it gets into working memory, how it gets into long-term memory. It's partly learning, but it's also partly performing. And some of what we care about is people's ability to perform, so we need to look at that as well. On top of that are the artifacts for learning from our cognitive architecture. There are a lot of artifacts from our cognitive architecture that aren't necessarily relevant to learning, but the ones that are the additions we add on top of that loop. Really importantly, this is not what we may have been doing historically for reasons that persist because that's the way we've always done it. It's not what, necessarily what school looks like, at least not, traditional school versus actually school that works. And it's not based on myths. There are a lot of myths that permeate our industry that have us believing things like learning styles and attention span of a goldfish and a bunch of stuff that's just not true. And we really need to be avoiding those if we're going to do the most effective learning. And when we talk about achieving retention over time and transfer to achieve impact, we really want to be doing that in the most efficient and effective ways. So we're not wasting time and money, which is why we have to avoid these approaches that aren't grounded in these sciences. So one of the things to think about is, what is the biggest miss in implementing learning? What is the opportunity that we're passing by that would have the biggest impact? And I want to suggest it's that action, the designed action in this case, that is what our biggest miss is. When you look at what we do in our learning design, too often, we're spending 80% of our time presenting content and 20% of the time having the learners actually do something, if that. And yet, really, it's much more important that they be doing things and getting feedback on doing things. We should be flipping that ratio at best. So a number of years ago, 4 folks who'd been in the e-learning field for a long time were at yet another expo, wandering around and thinking, there's fancy new buzzwords and new tools and new toys, and yet nothing's fundamentally changed. We're still seeing a lot of the problems. And so they created what they called the Serious E-Learning Manifesto. And that was Michael Allen of Allen Interactions, who's been a guru for learning design for decades, Julie Dirksen, who wrote the fabulous book, Design for How People Learn, Will Thalheimer, one of our great translators of research to practice, and one other person came together and identified 8 values that they really wanted to separate out what made a difference from learning, what serious e-learning and Michael was the one who sort of coined the phrase. He was inspired by the Agile Manifesto and Serious Games, said, why don't we have Serious E-Learning Manifesto? And so we proposed these 8 differentiators between typical e-learning and serious e-learning. And one thing that you should notice here is one of the recurrent elements to be seen is that practice permeates all these differences. Focused on performance, that's about learning to perform via practice and making meaningful learnings. They recognize that the practice is relevant to what they have to do. And context and decisions and consequences are all putting you in place where you are in a context where you have to make a decision and you experience the consequences. Self-space practice, again, practice is critical. And yet I think that's way underplayed. And I think the biggest differentiator we can make to make our learning more successful is to improve what we do in terms of the action or practice that we have our learners perform. So a starting point to me to really that gives us the necessary shift is to start talking about performance focus, not content focus. And to make that as concrete as possible for the purposes of designing deeper learning, I want to say that learning objectives are not the appropriate way to think about it. We don't want learning as our outcome. Just knowing new things doesn't mean we're going to change our behavior. There's, I think, a legacy of a view of cognitive psychology that says we're formal, logical, reasoning beings, says that, oh, well, if we're giving new information, we'll change our behavior. And yet the evidence doesn't say that that's actually the case. The evidence says we actually have to be doing the things. We need performance objectives. We need to stipulate the objectives for the outcomes of the experiences we design in terms of what people can be able to do differently. And that is a critical element to making deeper e-learning that's actually going to make a difference, that's going to have that impact we really need. So to me, another core of this is using that performance to drive what authentic context, what realistic decisions, and what real-world consequences come out of this. And to me, a useful way to frame this is to think about we're really having learner-created stories. So there's a goal that they're trying to achieve in their practice. Oh, something's happened and I need to achieve this goal. And I'm in a role where I have to take action to achieve that goal. And there's a world in which that goal and role makes sense. And from the purposes of looking at the Serious E-Learning Manifesto, the goal is really the consequences. We want to find out, we want to achieve the positive consequences at the risk of achieving the non-positive consequences by the decisions we make. And the role is a person who is in the position to make those decisions. So this is an important way to frame what we're thinking about in terms of designing practices, putting it into this framework, and the world is the context. So just as we had, consequences and decisions and context in that Serious E-Learning Manifesto, that manifests in these ways in terms of practice. And our brains are wired to understand story, and there's evidence that making it in a real context, not abstract and arbitrary and purely theoretical problems to solve, but real world ones in context, leads to better outcomes. Therefore, what learning science is telling us is that indeed do put your problems into a setting. Don't ask them arbitrary knowledge recognition questions. Put them in the place of making decisions. So another element is making it meaningful to learners. So first of all, your choice of performance objectives should be communicated to them in a way that they go, yes, I get why this is relevant to me. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later, but it's also about making sure that the practice they get is appropriate for them in a way that they recognize. An important focus on this is the questions we have. So the level of challenge required, the difficulty of the problem has to match the skill. If it's too difficult for the skill level of the learner, it's frustrating and no learning happens. That's not a good outcome. But if it's too simple, it's boring. And again, no learning happens. And many times when I run, workshops or give sessions, I ask the audience, how many of you have ever seen a question where the alternatives to the right answer were so silly or obvious, you could have gotten it right without learning anything? Everybody raises their hand. Everybody's seen this. And that's really important, because why would you waste the effort to do such a question? It doesn't lead to any learning. It's not appropriate. You do need simple questions at the beginning, but as learners start performing, getting practice and feedback, which we'll talk about in a moment, their ability increases, and the challenge you need to give them needs to increase until they're performing at the level you need them to be able to performing at outside the learning experience, and then you're done. But you can't have nonsensical questions, nonsensical practice going on. You really need people to be performing in this optimum zone between boring and frustrating. And you're going to make your best guesses, but you may have to test it, to tune it, to make sure you've got it right. Don't assume that just because you've built it, it's at the right level, the right progression. So that's action. What about reflection? If we have designed action, what is our guided reflection? Well, it can include just asking people, giving them time to reflect, asking them, but there's more. So when I break reflection out, the first thing, of course, is feedback. If you get practice, you need feedback. And it can't be just random feedback or right or wrong. You really need specific choices. The right alternative to the right answer, the correct alternatives to the right answer, are ways learners reliably go wrong. They do. There's some randomness in our architecture, but most of the mistakes people make are patterned. And you've heard this when you interview the experts or their supervisors, and you go, no matter what I do, they still go out and make this mistake. Great. You want to build that into the learning experience. And that's how you get that challenge. That's how you increase that difficulty, is making sure the alternatives are plausible and yet wrong. But in that case, you need very specific feedback. There's more that goes into that, of course. There's a bunch of output about feedback that says it needs to be not, it needs to be about the behavior, not the person. And you may need to also present them with their response. If they can't remember what they responded, you need to show that along with the right answer so they understand why they got it wrong. Feedback that doesn't help learners improve isn't useful. So feedback's an important part of reflection, just so you're connecting learners to their learning experience. Then you need models. Turns out an interesting aspect of our cognitive architecture is we build models of the world. It's happening all the time. New research and talking about predictive coding suggests our brains are continually running in the background, including you right now, predicting what I'm going to say next. And if you're right, that not much happens. But if you're wrong, it triggers a quest to figure out how to fix it, whether it's changing the world or changing your understanding. Now, there are specific features about models that are really important, because not any model is helpful here. What you need are models that give you a basis to predict what's going to happen or explain what happened. They're causal in terms of showing what's going to be an outcome. The reason you need models like this, and they're conceptual as well, so you can map them to different contexts. But the important reason why they're causal is then you can say, if I do this, this will happen. If I do that, that will happen. This is better than that, so I will choose this. You're giving a basis to make decisions. And in general, I will suggest that in almost all situations, there are reasons why you make decisions in certain ways. There are procedures you're following. They're in that order for a particular reason about causality. The ways you deal with people are built upon our understanding of how people react in different situations. There are models, and we need to present them, because one of the funny artifacts of our cognitive architecture is if we build models all the time. If we build a bad model, when it's proved wrong, we don't say, please, sir, may I have another model? we patch it. And then if it's still wrong, we'll patch it again. And we end up with this patched together model instead of the correct model. And the likelihood that it actually converges isn't high enough. So we should be giving people good models before. And we see this in sports when they say, you know, swing through the ball. That's a model about, it's actually talking about don't just stop once you hit it, but you follow through. And that holds in a variety of sports. That's a model about how the world works that we're using to get people to perform. So we want to give people models. Another type of reflection are examples. So we've got these models, but sometimes it helps to see how they play out in a particular context. The models are conceptual, they're not contextualized. So what examples do is show us how that model plays out in the real world. So we talk about a particular situation and then some action we took and the outcome that occurs. And really, we should portray that in a narrative flow, but we should also show the underlying thinking. Evidence again suggests that when you show that underlying thinking, it's really important for learners, and it should explicitly connect to the model. It turns out also that particularly for novices, being shown worked examples with the underlying thinking, showing the context and how you think through the model and how it gets contextualized here and how it leads to a good solution is better than practice. If you give people a few worked examples and then give them practice, it's better than just giving them all practice for novices. But that's really important to understand, and make sure you have examples that dot the I's and cross the T's on the nuances that make examples work. So the reflection we provide is really all of these things, feedback on the practice, as well as models and examples. And we really want to keep that minimal other than that. Anything else really just adds to the load of trying to learn instead of helping assist in the learning. And that's not a good outcome. So we've talked about the importance of action, and we've talked about the importance of reflection, but there's more. What we want to do also is talk about engagement. It turns out that our commitment to the learning experience actually matters. In cognitive science, we talk about a term called conation. We talk about cognition, affect, and conation. Cognition is the typical stuff we do our instructional design for to make sure we learn things and know things. Affect is who we are, not learning styles, but just our personality. That doesn't really change. In principle, who we are is a sort of a fixed. But conation is this third element that is our intent to commit to action or learning. And this has an effect on the success of any intervention. Now, conation is a term that not many people know. So instead of calling it conation, I tend to talk about emotion. The elements I talk about really aren't emotions, but it's just a convenient way to separate out cognition from emotion. And I think that that's an important component to add to our learning design. And to me, this is what separates out traditional instructional design from learning experience design. I believe learning experience design is the elegant integration of learning science with engagement. What that means is that we address the elements that lead to the cognitive learning in consonance with the elements that lead to the emotional experience. You can't just slap them together. They've tried this where they put instructional designers and game designers in a room, and what comes out is chocolate covered broccoli or whole wheat crusted candy. It doesn't work. You really have to understand the principles that create that engagement and that alignment. But when you do, you can reliably create learning experiences that work. And I'm just noticing the chat. Yes, errors. Exactly, Rob. We need to give them a chance to make the errors in the learning experience so we can address them there, not when it happens outside in the performance environment. That's what we don't want them to make the errors, right? So let them get it out of their system in the learning experience. And great, Susan. The elegant integration, I think it's really important, that word of elegant as well as integration. It's not just the smashing up, but understanding how they align. So appreciate that. So here we're talking about, it's not attendance driven. It's not by how much time you spend in a seat, or even that you spend time in the seat, but that you're there for a reason. You understand why you're willing to commit the effort to contribute because you get that this is relevant for you. And when I talk about emotion, this is hypothetical, it's conceptual, but I think it's something we should be explicitly thinking about, is what is the emotional trajectory our learners go through as they go through the learning experience? What should it be? I want to suggest that, and this is just a hypothetical structure of, motivating example, objectives, concept examples, practice, 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 reflection. It's indicative of our typical learning experience. It's not entirely accurate. That varies depending on a number of things. But what we want to do is build initial motivation. So from the get-go, from the introduction, they're motivated. They go, okay, I get why this is relevant to me. Now, once we've done that, we need to keep that motivation throughout the learning experience. When we get to the end, it can dissipate because we don't need it anymore. They've had the motivation to persist the learning experience. Now, in consonance with that, we don't want to have anxiety get too high, because anxiety interferes with learning beyond a certain point, and that point is relatively low. And learning in itself is somewhat anxiety-induced. So we need to find ways to keep that anxiety from overwhelming learners and interfering with their ability to commit to the experience and get the benefit of it. So it might initially, their motivation comes up, but their anxiety about it might go up too. And how do we keep that down? And then might come back up with the first practice. We need a way to keep that under control. And I don't think we think enough about this. And this is a point I really want to bring about, is we should be explicitly considering this and designing for it. And the final element, and one of the reasons of motivation can go down, is because we want to build confidence. We want, over the experience, learners to build confidence to a level that after the learning experience, they're willing to give this a go in the real world, in the performance environment. We need them to be able to say, okay, I'm not motivated because I'm confident enough, I'm going to give it a try. Now, this is just the learning event in a sense, which we really shouldn't have. After this, we want to continue to develop learners. There's more that goes on here. If they are confident, but their first attempt, they make a mistake, their confidence is going to drop. How do we turn that into a learning experience and rebuild their confidence? How do we provide some coaching that makes them feel good? We talk about, DC and Ryan talk about self-determination theory and posit 3 elements that really lead to people feeling satisfied and motivated. And that is autonomy, given the freedom to act; mastery, given a level of support and development so that they can achieve that goal that they have the autonomy to pursue; and relatedness, feeling like other people are committed to their success as well. And that comes from the design and learning experience and the subsequent experience as well. We want to help them, give them the freedom that they know they can develop this. So motivation, I suggest that there's 2 elements to getting a motivating experience going. And the first one is that first hook, that first awareness on their part that there is this opportunity. I kind of want them to have an expression that, I do need this, and I don't know it, and this experience will change that. We may have undermined that last one a wee bit with our existing learning experiences. We may have to make an extra effort to get them to buy into that. But if we consistently deliver on that promise, we have a chance. So to me, the hook is the introduction. It actually may even be an invitation before they actually start the learning experience. They should be invited to come in, and they should be asked to let know even beforehand why this is relevant to them. But we need to reinforce that in the learning experience. And I think that comes from with them. What's in it for me? they should be presented. We have performance objectives. We talked about that at the beginning. We have performance objectives we use to design the experience. That's not what we present to our learners. Those are written for our purposes. A good performance objective says, we have, this performance in this context to this level of observable outcome. That's great for us. That's not what learners want to hear. They want to hear the objectives in terms of things they care about. I'll be able to successfully help my customers. I'll be able to achieve my sales goals, whatever they are. That needs to be there with them. And that comes, I want to suggest, in terms of the positive consequences of having the learning or the negative consequences of not having the learning. But they need to viscerally understand that this learning is important for them. Not just cognitively, but viscerally. They need to internally, emotionally be committed and going, this is important. And it's not just guilt. There's more, a lot more that this unpacks to. But at this point, that's really important. So James Billingham asks, do I suggest using advanced organizers before the hook? And my short answer is no. Advanced organizers address the cognitive. I think they're really important, but I don't think they work as well until people are already emotionally committed. So I do believe that a really good approach here is to, in fact, hook them in even before the learning experience, again, with an invitation and an introduction, and then they're ready for the advanced organizer that will help them prepare for the rest of the learning experience and activate the relevant prior knowledge and let them structure. So I hope that helps. So in addition to the hook, once you've hooked them, you've got to land them, to use a fishing metaphor, and I'm not a fisher person, so I will admit that I may have this metaphor munged up, but for the purpose here, it's really about maintaining that motivation through the experience, maintaining that commitment so they don't drop out. And I want to suggest that, as we talked about before, maintaining that right level of challenge, which is important for learning outcomes, but it's also important for engagement. That diagram with the optimum flow came from Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow, and that people are most engaged when they're in that zone. It also comes from Vygotsky's zone of proximal development that says that's where learning happens, but they're aligned perfectly. But that means what makes effective learning makes engaging experiences. We want to leverage that in the case of building motivation for the learning. Plus the story, I talked about putting the practice as story, so people feel like they're being immersed in playing parts and roles and stories. And safety. Remember, I talked about anxiety. We want to make it safe to fail. We want people to get it wrong, be willing to get it wrong in the learning experience. They don't have to, but if they're going to get it wrong in the performance environment, I'd rather they get them wrong in the learning experience and learn not to get it wrong before they go out to the performance experience. I see Kay Fernandez asking, what do you suggest if the students have a lot of technical information that they need to know? I like Van Marienboer's 4-component instructional design because he talks about the information you need and the complex problems you apply that to. I have no problem with learning that information. I kind of want it scattered through. I want them to use the base information and then quickly apply that before they go in and get more complexities around it. So I do believe it's important. I really want them to retrieve it in the way they'll use it, though, not just test all that knowledge. Now, there is occasionally stuff they need to know cold. That happens like in medical vocabulary is my classic example. They need to know all the different labels for the parts of the body that everybody agrees on. Then drill and kill makes sense. And that's the only time it makes sense. We overly emphasize the knowledge instead of the ability to apply it. And that comes from that view that if we have information, we'll perform differently. That's not the case. We give them the information, but then we need to get them using and applying it regularly. I hope that helps. Yes, med student scenario, exactly. And if you look at the problem-based learning approach that the University of Sydney instituted, they put learners for each week of the introductory whole year. They put learners in scenarios each week that caused them, that drove them to the information to make them able to solve the problem instead of giving the information up front. I believe strongly that it helps to put the problem and drive students to the learners, make it meaningful first, as opposed to just dumping it on them beforehand. Motivation is the hook and landing them, getting that initial motivation so they're willing to commit to the experience, and then maintaining that commitment to go through the experience. So we are coming to the end, and so we are going to have time for questions, happily, because we like questions, we like discussion, because we get to unpack things that I forget to even mention, and that's really good. So deeper learning, we're really concerned with deeper learning, and that's really both deeply applying the cognitive and learning sciences and recognizing the contribution that emotion works. So it is meaningful practice and feedback. We have to have people doing things so that they are practicing applying that knowledge and having the chance to get it wrong. But if they get it right, we can reward that and reinforce that. Minimal appropriate resources. Yes, we need models and examples. We want to make sure we have sufficient, but no more than that. So we really want to focus on not too much content, because as soon as we go beyond that, we're actually interfering with the learning. We're creating what they call cognitive overload. We're overloading cognitive load, and therefore we're interfering with the learning experience. And engagement. All of this is to achieve performance impact, not to create just learning outcomes, but to actually have an impact on the business that moves the needle, that says, we aren't doing this. When somebody comes and asks for a course, what is the evidence that we're below? Yes, and what is the evidence that we're insufficient, and how will we know we've succeeded? And that's what you want to know, so that you can design an experience that will actually achieve that. That, to me, is what deeper learning really is, why we want it, and what we have to do to get it. At this point, I do want to mention that if you have specific needs in your organization you'd like to discuss one-on-one with me or with the organization as a whole, contact us at elearning@upsidelearning.com, and we'll connect with you and figure out how we can help. Maybe a conversation with me, maybe a conversation with the team. And there's a white paper that covers deeper e-learning that's available at upsidelearning.com. And I think Isha has promised to put the link in the chat to download that white paper. And you can read a bit more about it that goes into greater depth than I'm able to in this presentation. So at this point, I want to thank you for your attention to this point. What do you do? Students say they only want to learn what is in the exams and in an MCQ format. That's because they don't understand why this matters to them. They want to do the minimum. They've been enculturated that the degree matters, not the learning. You have to help them understand what this is, how this is relevant to them, or why this is relevant to them. And if it isn't, good on them. You really need to know yourself why it's relevant to them, how it's interviewed, and then communicate that. And so we have created an environment in which that happens. By the way, I see a number of questions coming in the Q&A. Please, feel free to toss them into the chat. I will address them, the ones in the chat as well. I mean, in the Q&A. What role? So Lillian asks, what role can AI play in helping create challenges for deep learning? Exactly what kind of role can be uniquely created by a facilitator? AI can parse content if it's well-written content. So first of all, it takes people in the loop to make sure it's good content. And then it can map it out and find out what, and assess you against it. But it can't create meaningful experiences. That's really still the role of the person. And I co-wrote an article with Marcus Bernhardt on that for Learning Solutions magazine. And I suggest you go look at it, because we explicitly addressed what AI can and can't do in creating learning experiences. Benjamin, great. You're welcome. Thank you. Laura asks, what do you suggest to engage sellers? that want 5-minute videos instead of reading or engaging in a course. You have to dig into why they think 5-minute videos are good. That may be one of the myths we have, is that, oh, well, if we break it up into 5-minute videos, they'll learn. There's actually evidence that they will pay attention for up to 5 minutes, actually 6 minutes, but that doesn't mean it's leading to any learning. You have to design learning to create learning. There can be points where people are at this, moment, that what I call it, the teachable moment, where they're doing something and they're right for just the right message. But being able to detect that and automatically send a 5-minute video isn't necessarily going to do it. People may be engaged. It may not lead to any improvement unless it's a performance support. There are lots of times I went to YouTube and found a video to help me fix my dryer. I didn't learn anything, but I fixed my dryer, and I promptly forgot whatever I did, but it helped me fix it. We need to separate out learning from performance support. And that's one of the confusions about them. These workflow learning says, oh, if you have to stop and reflect, you're out of the workflow. If you're not stopping or reflecting, you're not learning. You may be succeeding, and that's okay. But be very clear about whether you're doing performance support or formal learning. I'm going to jump back to the chat right now here, and then I'll go back to the questions. What are the challenges that e-learnings are facing to design for deep learning? That's pretty tough. I think the challenge is the expectations. People expect that if I give you PDFs and PowerPoints, you can put it on the web and add a quiz and create an engaging learning experience, and they don't understand effectiveness. So we've created this expectation that learning can be done cheaply and quickly, and nobody's paying attention to the outcomes until they start measuring the impact and iterating until they achieve that impact. We're going to have these expectations. We need to change that. Thank you. This been firming for the opportunity to love. Okay, challenge we have, trying to quickly and clearly articulate this to business and learning leaders. Any advice? Yes, Susan. I believe in the kitchen sink approach. Be prepared with a variety of things, to be able to talk to them about how do you learn, do you have anything you do for fun outside of work, whether it's sport, hobby, craft? How did you learn that? How much of that was a course versus how much was doing it and getting feedback? Help them understand their own experience. Also have the empirical evidence to hand. Talk about what actually leads to learning change and what doesn't. Also have personal stories. Have stories about what the competitors are doing. Have all these different things and figure out what's going to work with that particular person you're trying to address right now, and work them. So I hope that gives you a leverage on that. Learning 10 piano pieces by rote gives you to play those 10 pieces, but you still aren't a pianist. Exactly, Rob. You want to, and I grew up in the day, I didn't learn to play the piano because they had me practice these things I didn't care about. Now they're finding out in music teaching that if you give them the start with a song they want to play, you'll actually get them to persist. And that makes such a big difference. Shubo says, the biggest hurdle I see is organizations don't allow you to learn or fail. Yeah, they expect you to know and succeed every time. Absolutely. There's a culture of learning that says we don't learn. We just do, and we do perfectly. And, you learn on your own, you're on your own responsibility. That is not a learning culture, because it doesn't give you time for learning. It doesn't recognize that learning requires mistakes. There's people who say we want innovation, and then they only want safe innovation. Innovation isn't safe. You absolutely have to create a culture where making mistakes is understood and expected in the learning experiences and also in the real world, because we formally learn to do the things we know we need to do. But then there's a bunch of things the organization is going to have to learn that nobody has the answer yet, or you build it into formal learning. That's innovation. But that's learning too, because you have to experiment and try things and figure out what works and what doesn't. You have to fail. And making that possible is, I think, a new and interesting role for L&D that we're not taking advantage of and should. Kate Fernandez, do you think using virtual patient scenarios to teach medical students is a good example of LD? The short answer is yes, and. in every case, just using something without understanding the good design principles behind it. Is VR good for your learning? Yes, when you're using it appropriately. No, if you're doing things like PowerPoint in a virtual world. There are very powerful things that I think you could be doing with virtual patient scenarios that absolutely are best done that way, but I wouldn't do everything that way. So it's really a matter about matching up the technology and approach you have. It's all about the learning design first. If you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. If you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter how you implement it. It's sort of my principle on that. How to make e-learning personalized, aligned to individualized challenges. Niranjan, I actually think that personalized is designing it beforehand for different roles. And so you might have product information, and the product information, some of it's the same, and then some of it differs depending on your role. Are you in sales, or are you in technical support? So part of the personalization is knowing what content is the same for everybody and what needs to go differentiated by role, and then giving them to that role. Adaptive, on the other hand, is how you respond to how they're performing in the experience. If they're struggling, you give them you move them back and give them some remedial material. If they're doing really well, you might ramp up the challenge. That's my difference between adaptive and personalized. But for your question about personalized, it would be making sure that you have the information that's specific to that individual available to them, and that they're not seeing stuff that isn't for other people. Thank you for your attention, and through this experience, greatly, I'm always pleased when people are willing to sit and listen to me. It's a great experience.